Hey guys, welcome to another episode of U.S. History with Lennox, and today we're talking about a crisis in the United States. And it's a crisis that we just don't seem to be able to escape. And it puts us on a path towards a war that's going to change our country forever. In this lecture, we're going to talk about the crisis of the Union that occurred between 1850 and 1860. Now, we have been on the road to the Civil War since, I think, 1803 with the Louisiana Purchase, and it was tied directly to westward expansion. But by the time we get to the 1850s, I think we're at that point of no return. Now, in 1850, we had negotiated a new compromise, and this was supposed to be the final compromise between the North and the South, one that would usher us into peace. Well, it is going to be the final compromise, but not for the reasons you think. The fact of the matter is, peace is not going to be established due to the Compromise of 1850. In fact, it's going to cause more conflict than we had before. One of the biggest parts of the compromise that caused the most conflict is going to be the Fugitive Slave Act. And this act is going to be highlighted in a novel that comes out in 1852 called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Written by abolitionist Harriet Beecher Stowe, Uncle Tom's Cabin is going to humanize the face of slavery. It's going to put a spotlight on the institution of slavery and everything negative about it. The separation of families, the mistreatment, the beatings, the attempted escapes, the bounty hunters that are going to chase these slaves down. And it's going to wrap it all up with some characters that people can start to identify with. What Uncle Tom's Cabin is going to do is it's going to inspire people to resist the Fugitive Slave Act. It had such an impact on North America that when Harriet Beecher Stowe met Abraham Lincoln, he basically said, "So you're the little woman that wrote the book that made this great war." He's basically saying that her book put us on the path to war. On top of that, it's going to highlight an institution that had been in our country for almost 60 years at this point, the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad, over a 65-year period, helped free nearly 100,000 slaves from the South. Now, while many of these slaves were able to escape on their own, there was a network of volunteers, including people like Harriet Tubman, who will work tirelessly to help slaves escape to the north, and then once the fugitive slave laws passed, escape beyond the northern states and into Canada. The 1852 presidential election really shows the division that's starting to happen in our country. We still are a two-party system with the Whigs and the Democrats, but the Whigs are split over this idea of slavery. You have the Free Soilers who have become part of their political party, who are against any expansion of slavery. And then, of course, you have the Democrats who, at this point, just support slavery, whether it's expanding into territories or staying where it is. Now, Franklin Pierce is going to be the winner of this election. He is a Democrat from New Hampshire. He had served in the Mexican-American War. His nickname is Handsome Frank. But unfortunately, Franklin Pierce did not have an answer for anything that we were dealing with as a country. He is going to sign the KansasNebraska Act, which I'll talk about in just a minute, and he's going to be referred to as what we call a doughface, someone who is pro-Southern. The Whigs just didn't trust him at all. Unfortunately for Franklin Pierce, he had his own problems. On the way to the White House for his inauguration, the train he was riding in derailed, and his son was pinned under it and killed. So he had to deal with the loss of his son throughout his presidency, and he was known to be a drinker. When he wasn't renominated for the presidency in the election of 1856, literally his answer was, "Well, I guess there's nothing left to do but for me to go get drunk." It was a shame and it was a tragedy, but unfortunately, beyond that, Franklin Pierce was just not the right president for us at that time. Along about the same time, in 1854, the South is looking for other opportunities to expand. The Ostend Manifesto is going to be drafted, and what this is going to talk about is the benefits of annexing Cuba into the United States. Within the manifesto, there is going to be a threat to war with Spain should they not approve the transfer of Cuba to the U.S. Congress actually approves it, but continued opposition from northern senators is going to stop it dead in its track. But it shows that expansion, honestly, manifest destiny is still guiding a lot of decisions in our country. The KansasNebraska Act is going to take head on this debate about allowing slavery to expand into territories. Now, we know with the Compromise of 1850 that it was determined that the people of the New Mexico Territory could decide whether or not they wanted to be a slave or a free territory based on popular sovereignty, based on a vote. Well, Stephen Douglas is going to introduce this KansasNebraska Act that will, in a sense, bring the same idea into this territory, which is fascinating because this territory already had a law that governed it, and that was the Missouri Compromise. If you remember correctly, the Missouri Compromise legislated the idea that no new slave states would be admitted north of the 3630 line in the Louisiana Territory. Well, that's where the Kansas and Nebraska territories are. Yet, this act passed through Congress, basically nullifying the Missouri Compromise. Now, many people believed that Kansas would go towards the slave side of the argument or become a slave state, whereas Nebraska would remain free. But it's still going to be determined by the people. And so what this is going to inspire is a race to Kansas between pro-slavery and anti-slavery people. The New England Emigrant Aid Society, this is a company that is going to organize a group of free soilers to move to Kansas so they can vote to keep Kansas free. They're also going to assist in this fight by sending Beecher Bibles into the Kansas Territory. Now, before you get all religious on me, let me explain what a Beecher Bible is. The Beecher family was a family of abolitionists. Harriet Beecher Stowe, that's part of her family. And what they're going to do is they're going to crate up a bunch of rifles and ship them to the Kansas Territory. Now, to hide the fact that they're sending weapons into this territory, they're going to mark these crates Bibles. Hence, it gets the nickname Beecher Bibles. At the same time, you're going to see a lot of pro-slavery advocates starting to move into the Kansas Territory from Missouri. We call these folks border ruffians. And what's going to happen with these pro-slavery and anti-slavery groups moving into the Kansas Territory, they're going to create their own government. You're going to have the Topeka government, which was a free soil government, and the Lecompton government, which was a pro-slavery government. And what they're trying to do is create a constitution that they can present to Congress to get statehood. And it's almost like a race to see who can get their constitution to Congress first. Well, with all these Beecher Bibles and all these border ruffians, you can kind of see a problem starting to brew. As a result, a direct result of the KansasNebraska Act, the Republican Party is going to form. This is going to be a coalition of free soilers, anti-slavery Whigs, and anti-slavery Democrats, along with a group of abolitionists. Now, the Republicans weren't abolitionists. They were free soilers, but they did have the support of a number of the abolitionists in the North. They are opposed primarily to the spread of slavery, not ending it, just stopping the spread. And they also, on their party platform, call for a repeal of the KansasNebraska Act as well as the Fugitive Slave Law. So all this is going on in 1854. You have a brand new political party forming, which with the division of other political parties. You have pro-slavery advocates coming in from Missouri called border ruffians. You have abolitionists supporting anti-slavery, free soilers who have moved down to Kansas, and they're arming them with Beecher Bibles, and this is really about to explode, and explode it does. We call it Bleeding Kansas. Now, it starts with the sack of Lawrence. That's basically Lawrence, Kansas was a free soil town that was attacked by pro-slavery forces. In retribution to what happened in Lawrence, a man by the name of John Brown and his followers, staunch abolitionists, are going to attack pro-slavery people at Pottawatomie. It's called the Pottawatomie Massacre. And literally what happened was Brown and his followers, for lack of a better description, hacked to death 5 pro-slavery people who were there. What is happening is you're starting to see a preview of the Civil War. You literally have a civil war occurring within the territory of Kansas. In the end, the fighting will go on for nearly 4 years and nearly 56 people will die. But guess what? The fighting is not just happening in Kansas, it's happening in Congress too. Charles Sumner was a senator from Massachusetts, and he is going to start condemning the events that are happening in Kansas. In this speech, he is going to call out and insult a senator from South Carolina, Andrew Butler. Well, the one thing you don't do in the South is insult someone's family, especially when that guy is not even there to defend himself. Andrew Butler had a nephew by the name of Preston Brooks. Preston Brooks was a congressman from South Carolina. When he heard of Sumner's comments about his uncle, he felt the need to defend his family honor, and so he is going to burst onto the Senate floor, tackle Sumner, and start beating him with a cane. We nicknamed it Bleeding Sumner. But that just shows you the passion and the anger that existed in our country in the 1850s. If it wasn't enough that we were divided on the question of the expansion of slavery, we also have another division rising in our country, and it's called nativism. And nativism was basically an anti-immigrant stance that people were taking in our country. During this time, we have our first major wave of immigrants coming into the United States. Nearly 1/3 of these immigrants are going to be coming in from Ireland due to the Great Potato Famine. The rest of them are primarily going to be German. And half of these immigrants enter into our country into the 1840s and continue into the 1850s. And the big problem people have with these immigrants is, number one, they're taking jobs. And, they're working for less, and they'll take whatever job they can get, so taking jobs away from Americans. And number two is about power, political power. They were worried that these immigrants were going to come in and almost take control of the political ideas of the North because there were so many of them. So what's going to happen in response to this is we're going to have yet another political party be formed. It's called the American Party. And Millard Fillmore, the guy who didn't run for re-election in 1852, is going to be their candidate. Their primary platform is nativism, and they are anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant. Now remember, most of these immigrants coming over are from Germany and Ireland. So we're divided basically on the question of spreading slavery. Now we're also divided on immigration and how that's going to be handled in our country. So all these divisions are taking part. It's just a matter of time before it explodes into war. But before we get to that, let's look at the election of 1856. This is when you have the Democrats running James Buchanan. Now, James Buchanan, what was so enticing about him was he hasn't been here. He had been a foreign minister over to England, and he hasn't been here with regards to when the compromise was passed, and he wasn't there, especially when the KansasNebraska Act was passed. So it was kind of like fresh eyes coming in to see, and he's going to have a new perspective and a new idea of how to handle it. He's going to run against John Fremont, who was the first Republican Party presidential candidate. And then we have our third party candidate in Millard Fillmore. And then we have our third-party candidate in Millard Fillmore, who is running for the Know-Nothings. Now, Buchanan wins, becoming the 15th president of the United States. And like I said, what was very attractive about Buchanan was he has not been part of the KansasNebraska Act. He was not part of the Compromise of 1850. So all these little decisions and legislations that have been passed in the last 6 years, he doesn't have any responsibility for. So he doesn't have any ties to it and no opinion on it. Interestingly, though, Buchanan was in on the initial conversations about annexing Cuba to the United States. But that's beside the point. Buchanan was seen as someone who was going to help elevate America out of all this sectional turmoil. Yet he had no decisions. The guy just would not take a stance. Completely indecisive with regards to secession. Completely indecisive with regards to repealing the KansasNebraska Act. And I think really what did him in was the Lecompton Constitution. Remember I told you there was a race between the Topeka government and the Lecompton government? Well, Lecompton got their constitution to the government, to the Congress, and Buchanan supported that one. Buchanan is a lame duck president from the day he takes office. It's almost like he's just sitting there waiting for the next guy to come in to let him handle all the problems. 1857, major Supreme Court case that you need to know. Dred Scott v. Sanford. Dred Scott was a slave who had lived with his master, a U.S. Army officer who had traveled, and they had ended up in the state of Illinois, a free state. When his master died, Dred Scott claimed that since he lived in a free state, he should have his freedom. So this is going to go to the Supreme Court. And before any decision is even made, the Supreme Court decides that Dred Scott has no voice in this court at all because he is an African slave. And they are not citizens. As not being citizens, they cannot appeal to the court. Once that decision was made, they could have just left it at that and walked away. But Roger Taney, the Chief Justice, just couldn't let it go. He's going to go a step further and say not only do Africans not have citizenship in our country, the government really has no authority to regulate these people because they are property. And for the very first time, we have officially referred to slaves as property. We've always treated them that way. We've always recorded it in our ledgers and everything that way. But the government has never actually referred to it. And Roger Taney and his court did it with Dred Scott. And they said because the U.S. government does not have the authority to regulate property, the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional. Wait, Lennox, how did you get there? Bear with me. The Missouri Compromise in 1820 basically regulated where slaves could be and couldn't be. And in that sense, the government is regulating what people could do with your property. You can take your property to Missouri, but you can't take it north of that. And Taney and his court said, the government cannot say that. So the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional. Well, this is going to raise fear in a lot of people in the North because they think this is an opening for a slaveocracy. And what do I mean by that? A slaveocracy would basically be a government supporting slavery throughout our entire country. And that's what a lot of people in the North feared, was this rise of a slaveocracy. Now, this decision is actually going to become the foundational idea behind the Lincoln-Douglas debates in 1857. Abraham Lincoln, who had been a former representative, remember the whole spot resolution? He's going to be running against Stephen Douglas for the Senate seat from the state of Illinois. And they're going to have a series of debates, 7 debates, throughout the state of Illinois, where they're going to be debating the idea of the free soil movement as well as the Dred Scott decision. When they had their debate in Freeport, Illinois, Lincoln is going to ask Douglas how he can justify popular sovereignty making the decision on slavery with regards to the Dred Scott decision, because he said, the court said that the government cannot regulate slavery. So how do you line that up with people having the right to vote for whether or not they have slavery if the court says, there can be no laws against it? Douglas is going to state what was called the Free Point Doctrine. He basically says that it doesn't really matter what the court said. Slavery is not going to exist anywhere unless the local people agree to it. This is going to tick off people in the South. Because with the Dred Scott decision, they thought, cool, we finally have the freedom to take our slaves wherever we want. And here's this Democrat, Douglas, saying, no, not if the local people vote against it. Now, Douglas is going to win the Senate seat. Lincoln loses, but the significance is he's going to lose a lot of popularity in the South. And Lincoln is going to gain a lot of notoriety with the Republican Party throughout the nation. Guess what happens next? I know you know. Finally, in 1859, John Brown's raid. John Brown, the same guy from the Pottawatomie Massacre, has a plan to raid the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry in Virginia. And in doing so, he's going to steal all of these federal weapons, and he's going to create a slave army that will march through the South And that's how slavery is going to come to an end. Now, he's going to be captured, put on trial, and convicted for treason, and he will hang. He is going to be seen as almost a martyr in the North and a villain in the South. And this is going to feed what's known as a conspiracy theory between the North and the South. See, both the North and the South had viewpoints on each other that were kind of rooted in misconception. You see, the North, I had mentioned the slaveocracy, but they also believed in the slave power conspiracy. They believed that the South wants to spread slavery throughout the nation, not just where they are, but they want it everywhere. And the South at the same time, especially when they see someone like John Brown come down, they're really worried that the North is planning to destroy slavery by igniting slave revolts, very similar to what John Brown wanted to do. And if one thing terrified people in the South, it was slave revolts. They had seen things like the Denmark Vesey revolt and Nat Turner's revolt, where slaves were armed and killed white people, and they were terrified that that was going to happen. And they thought that the people in the North were trying to organize this, and John Brown was just the first one to show up, basically. This is all going to lead us to the presidential election of 1860, where you have Abraham Lincoln running on the Republican ticket and the Democrats split between Stephen Douglas and John Breckinridge. When you look at this ballot, the Northern Democrats supported Stephen Douglas. They believed in popular sovereignty and enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act. But remember, because of the Freeport Doctrine, Southerners were ticked off at Stephen Douglas. So they're going to nominate John Breckinridge. John Breckinridge believed in the expansion of slavery, also believed in the annexation of Cuba. At the same time, the Republicans are going to run Abraham Lincoln, and their platform is no extension of slavery. Keep slavery where it is. That's that free soil idea. They want to keep a protective tariff, which will make the manufacturers in the North happy. They want to build a Pacific Railroad, a transcontinental railroad, which is going to make people in the West happy. And they also want to create a homestead legislation, which will give free land to homesteaders who want to move west. That's going to make farmers happy. Southern secessionists, when they see Lincoln on the ticket, they're worried. They threaten, if he wins, we're out. Well, and that's exactly what's going to happen, because Lincoln does win the election. The Democrats split the ticket. Well, there was one last effort at compromise. It's called the Crittenden Compromise. And the idea was to calm the fear of the South. And what the Crittenden Compromise said was, hey, let's just return to the Missouri Compromise, that 36-30 line, and draw that line all the way across the country. Lincoln says no. Because remember, Lincoln doesn't want to see slavery expand at all. And so he's like, we're not extending slavery. And that was it. Once that failed, we're going to see 7 states secede from the Union before Lincoln even takes office. And so the next step is going to be war. And that's coming in our next lecture. If you have any questions, don't forget, put them down in the comments. Otherwise, we'll see you the next time around. I appreciate you watching. Hey, go ahead and subscribe. I know you want to. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.